So Pete lives on our street. And by that, I don't mean like he lives in one of the houses or one of the apartments. I mean, he lives on the street. I mean, to be fair, maybe like a foot or two back from the curb, but he lives on the kind of the grass and on the sidewalk. And then like where we live on Rock Hill, which kind of goes down into Gillum, there's a very large kind of linear piece of property that the city owns that has a lot of brush. And so he expands into that area too. And when Pete first showed up about a year and a half or two ago, you know, I was like, he's a lot like the people many of us seek, serve, I do at Cherith Brook weekly, you know, being friendly. And it quickly became apparent that he was a pretty erratic person, that he could be aggressive. He, you know, kind of would yell. And then he was a builder. At the start he showed up, it was like a sleeping bag and a, you know, backpack or two. But then the next day there were pieces of plywood and, you know, grocery carts, and he would pick up everybody's trash. And it wasn't so much like a tiny house as it was like a spaceship. And it's kind of a tricky thing because we don't have a lot of kids on the street, but we have a home for disabled adults who walk down the street. And it just became a situation where he would kind of lunge out at you and he'd be in the street. And so I did what I don't want to do. I didn't call the police. I called the homeless coordinator, 311, right? Sure enough, they show up, social worker and the police, and then Pete is taken somewhere where Pete can be cared for, right? Like we all, like those of us who are old enough to remember state hospitals, Terrell State Hospital. When I was in seminary at TCU, I knew somebody who was a chaplain there for 40 years. I mean, serving people who could not live safely in the community where they were provided for. And we all know Reagan and deinstitutionalization, those places are gone. Those people are on the street, they're homeless, right? So for a while, Pete is cared for. And then a month goes by, Pete's right back at it, right? And, you know, pretty quickly, the spaceship gets bigger, and you're just like, where does he get all this material? So the same thing happens, you know, you kind of try to deal with it, and then call the homeless coordinator, they come out, Pete leaves, 30 days later, Pete's back. And then it gets more complicated because you realize there's like a drug house. It's actually more like a drug series of apartments in a big apartment building. These people are supplying Pete with plywood and pills and pot and all kinds of stuff, right? And then you realize there's broken cars and stolen cars, and then you realize part of the problem is there's so much thick brush back there, right? Just so much thick brush. So then since your husband's an attorney who works for the city, that does work, you know, you got the KC Parks and Rec people out there to clear it out, right? I don't mean they came out there with a couple of guys with the weed whacker. I mean trucks and tractors and a full team, and they were there for a week. And I was just like, oh my God, this is so embarrassing, the resources I am spending to get Pete out of the picture, right? And then on the weekend, there was a volunteer group that showed up. I mean, it was just like young, idealistic people like clearing it out, and you're just thinking, on the one hand, I mean, nobody wants to wake up every morning and go out and have your car bashed in, right? You don't want to, you know, but it's just one of those examples of like, the question isn't what happened to Jesus' body. The question is, why don't we look more resurrected? Right? I mean, why don't we look more like a community where we're all in there for one another and we're caring for one another? This morning, we get this image of a resurrected community. And again, scholars aren't sure if this ever happened. It's called a summary passage or a sweeping passage. But in this idea, you know, it's like there was not a needy person among them because everybody who had houses and land, basically it was like your stuff was in a trust. And when some need was made, you would sell it, and then that would be distributed to other people. And some scholars say that's the reason the early church grew so rapidly, right? Went from a dozen people to 70 people to thousands of people, was because the early church cared about people in a time when the Roman Empire was very wicked and cruel, right? So people took in the widows and the orphans, and, you know, this sense of just, you know, Bernie Sanders' community took off. And other scholars say, oh, come on, really? The early church took off in the 3rd or 4th century when it became the religion of the Roman Empire, right? And then when it was just like forced on. Now, we don't really know the truth, right? It's probably a mixture of all of that. But one of the things that you see in this passage is that this kind of abundant giving and sharing, it's not done out of a commandment. The scripture doesn't say, in Deuteronomy, you remember you're supposed to leave a tithe of your field. Rather than harvesting all your apples, you're supposed to leave a tenth of it. Kind of an Old Testament law. That's where the idea of giving a tenth away comes from. In this, it states, no, they were just so joyful and thankful and happy and connected. Everybody was giving their testimony. Everybody woke up in the morning and thought, The resurrection is everywhere, and I'm so thankful for the love and care that I have received that I just want to give, right? So it's just this joyous, incredible giving community. And then beyond that, it's like a community of trust, because it doesn't say like, you know, hey, who's got an extra blanket or sweater or old pair of shoes they don't need or a mattress? No, it says they took their stuff, their land and their houses, and they sold it, and they gave the proceeds to anyone who had need. That meant, what were they giving to people? Cash, right? They were giving freely and unconditionally. It's like, here, you take it, I trust it. That is really hard to do. I mean, it's really hard to kind of live and trust that way. I mean, even in our own families, right? To kind of live in a way in which every single person is cared for, and there's not a needy person, and everybody is all in there together. My dearest friend, Cindy, you all have heard me talk about her many times. We grew up together in the same church, and then we literally shared a call into the ministry in the late 70s when not very many women were going into ministry, and our youth minister set us down at the end of youth group one day and talked to us when we were in middle school or high school and said, I really think you all are called to the ministry. And we went to Texas A&M together, and then went to seminary together, and we'd done everything together. And she's just 6 months older, but she's so much wiser, and she's like the big sister I've always had. And I tell you what, they've had every single challenge. Her husband's been the superintendent, one of the largest school districts in Texas, which has been ground zero for the Tea Party, been a nightmare trying to hold that school district and keep the crazy people who want to like bash trans kids and bash immigrant kids, and he's just been trying to hold that back. And she was a pastor, and then there's cancer and hip surgery, and there are 3 kids with challenges, and the daughter's divorced, and it's just been, and her mother died 2 weeks ago. So I just saw her this week, and we've been talking about how she's been managing all this, and she is, again, one of the brightest people, and she's open about sharing this. Her therapist has kept saying to her every time she comes with some major issue or some major challenge or some major hurt about her kids or grandkids or whatever, and the therapist says something so incredibly eloquent and wise and profound, which is, you can't fix that. You can't fix that. You can't fix that. I mean, it sounds really simple, right? But it's really a very profound thing. I mean, on the one hand, it's kind of at the basis of faith, right? You can't fix that. I mean, whether you're Jewish, Christian, Muslim, whatever, what's the whole point of it on some level? Turns out there's something bigger than Holly McKissick, right? Turns out there's something in the universe that kind of set us into motion. There's some creative, it doesn't, guess what? It turns out it does not all depend on me, right? And when you kind of take that in, there's something about it that's incredibly freeing. And her latest challenge is that, with her mother's death, this is a very familiar story. I don't think people realize how familiar this is, but there are multiple siblings in the family, and there are those siblings who have adulted and are doing well, and then there's the siblings who we're talking 40s and 50s and 60s, still mooching off the parents, right? Still wrecking a car and expecting another car, still burning down their house because they're smoking too much or whatever and expecting. And so it's just been so painful to deal with. And she's been trying to figure out, how to work with, the parents and see that, it's not just like, how much more can we give to these kids who are, and again, what has her therapist said to her over and over and over again? You can't fix that. First of all, your parents have made this choice about how they're going to deal with it. And your bigger siblings have made this choice. And guess what? You cannot fix that. And the thing about that is when you go with that, then it sort of frees you up to think, okay, well then, what can I do? This has really impacted my idea about global poverty and giving and the best way to live. And some of you have heard me talk about this. Peter Singer is a professor of philosophy and ethics at Princeton and also in Australia. It's I think he's probably won that, MacArthur Genius Grant, the most good you can do. He's a really interesting thinker about tackling poverty and looking at how we live in this world together. He's not a proponent of giving money to the opera. He's not a proponent of giving money to send a sick kid to Disney World. He's a proponent of taking every dollar and doing the most good you can, like lifting the most people out of poverty. Some of you have heard me talk about this before. If you've got $1, if you got $100 you're going to give away, what are some of those impactful things you can do on the planet? Well, one of them, mosquito nets. A mosquito net costs $2. $100, you've got $100, you can keep 50 people from getting malaria. Malaria is a horrible disease. Deworming kids, that's the main reason kids miss school around the world. It's not they can't afford the uniform or their parents don't have it. It's worms. 50 cents, you can deworm a kid for a year. For $100, you can keep 200 kids in school. And what about blindness? I mean, I was mentioning this, like the Helen Keller, the eye drop stuff. I mean, you can prevent very preventable eye diseases. You can restore a person's sight in some poor countries for $25. For $100, you could have 4 people who cannot see, who can't plow their field or feed their kids. Their eyes are open, right? And because of work like this, the global poverty rate, which was 2 billion in 1990, anybody know what it is today? 700 million. People are making progress, right? And a big part of what they're about is like letting your fingers off the need to control. So they're also the people kind of behind, which I've talked about before, the big movement of give directly. Because it turns out if you've got one of the poorest villages, let's say Liberia or Kenya, you've got 300 people, really desperate, what's the most impactful thing you can do? Build a well, bring somebody in to teach them about new plants. The most impactful thing you can do is give every single person a cell phone, and once you've got every single person assigned to somebody on the same day of the month, everybody gets $40. Everybody gets $40. And you know what those people do with that $40? They pull their money together, they get a cow, it begins to transform, right? It's called give directly, and it's about nothing beats unconditional cash. That's not to say somebody doesn't take that cash and drink it. Don't you think they do? I mean, again, witness our siblings, right? But it's all about like freeing it up. And again, it goes back to when you realize you can't fix it, then what can you do? Like even here, kind of in the United States, some of you know who Derek Hamilton is. He's also an economist. He was at Ohio State. My daughter worked with him some with the Cordray race when he was running for governor, but he runs the Race and Equity Center there, and now he's back in New York. He's on an MSNBC summit. He is the person who's talked the most about baby bonds. Baby bonds are a way to try to tackle the racial wealth gap in this country. The average black family has a dime for every dollar the average white family has. That is because wealth has nothing to do with behavior or genetics. In this country, wealth has been created from one main thing, and do you know what that is? Government programs. Most wealth in this country began by the Homesteader Act, the GI Bill, being able to buy a FHA loan, right, without having to put anything but 5% down. And guess who could not access any of those things? That would be black people, right? So, and he knows a lot about this personally because he grew up Bedford-Stuyvesant, a very poor area. He saw both of his parents died when he was a teenager, trying so hard to help him make it. They got him into Brooklyn Friends School, one of the most, exclusive schools. So every day he would play in the neighborhood with kids who had nothing, and then he would play at school with kids who had everything. And he was like, these kids are all the same, except for guess what? One group doesn't have anything, right? And so he spent his life working on this idea. It's a really simple idea. Instead of families having to sign up for it, it means every time a baby is born in this country, somebody, the state, the federal government, opens an account, and based on if the kid's Medicaid eligible or if they're a wealthy family, an amount is put in that account. And then when the kid is 18 to 30, the kid can take the money out for what? Education, buying a house, starting a business, or seeding a retirement account. I mean, and what he says is it's a love letter to the future generation. It's like saying, I don't think about my little sister through Big Brothers Big Sisters. Like, if she knew this country cares about me enough, when I turn 18, it's going to be $15,000 right there. Because you know what the difference is between a renter and a homeowner? A down payment, folks. That's what it is, right? It's not about somebody's worth more or less. And you think, well, that's crazy. How could we possibly do that? You know how much that would cost a year? Like $7 billion. Anybody know what the defense budget last year was? $880 billion, over $4 billion just to aid to Israel. $75 billion just to Lockheed Martin. Really? We can't come up with $7 billion frickin' dollars because we're so busy blowing the world up, right? Do the best you can do. Can you fix it? Can you fix it? Folks, we have got some really difficult situations right now. 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, really, and you can't fix it. But what can you do? You can show up with as much love and care as you can. So my dear friend Cindy, and the days in which her mother was dying, looking at what was going to happen with the will and how, it was just going to keep going to somebody who keeps having a wreck and keeps getting a new, and the whole thing. And she just kept telling herself, you can't fix it. Showing up in that house with as much light and love as she could, walking in there with her heart as open and present and freeing and uncontrolling. And what she told me was the more she did that, the more she felt herself healing. Just her anger and hurt and disappointment, the more she's just found herself feeling freer and freer and freer. Eastertide, folks. What happened to Jesus' body? I don't know, but I want to look more resurrected when we get to Pentecost. I want to wake up each day and be looking for the people out there making the solutions, and I want to hook my wagon to it because I want to live freer. I want to let go. I want to let go of trying to control so I can do the most good I can and love and be loved. Amen.